Drugs are very effective scapegoats. They allow you to basically take a cornucopia of social ills, project them onto a particular group or demographic, and blame them for a lot of structural problems that permeate our society, right? In terms of inequality, racism, abandonment by the state, all these other things get to be rolled into one phenomenon. One of the reasons the drug war has never worked is that the policies of drug prohibition contain the seeds of their own failure. It's a catch-22, in that what we're talking about when we talk about the violence in Mexico or Colombia or on our streets in the United States, it's not so much that it's caused by the drugs themselves. It's caused by the fighting over market share, the right to distribute these drugs. And so as we fight the war on drugs, we end up making these things much more valuable. When we talk about things like marijuana, cocaine, heroin, methamphetamines, these are essentially minimally processed agricultural and chemical commodities. They cost pennies per dose to manufacture in the real world. It's our policies of prohibition, though, that give these substances such astronomical escalation of value. The patent medicines back in the day, Civil War era, for instance, were loaded with morphine, heroin, opium, cannabis tinctures, cocaine, all kinds of drugs. And it did make you feel better. Medicine was not very advanced at the time. They couldn't really cure a lot of diseases, but they could kill the pain. And so a lot of people used these things. By the time the first drug laws occurred in this country, they were done at the municipal level in San Francisco. And they were targeted at people who looked like me. Part of it was because at that time there was a recession in this country. The railroads had been were finished, and the transcontinental railroads were finished, and a lot of Chinese labor was now competing in the middle of a recession with white labor. And one of the ways to go after minority groups, in this case Chinese Americans, was to target things that were associated with their culture. The idea of opium dens. And if you look at the editorial cartoons in the San Francisco newspapers at the time, they were incredibly racist. With the war on marijuana, for instance, the stigmatization first began in the southwest border states. And it was the reason we call it marijuana rather than cannabis is we use the Spanish word to stigmatize it and associate it with Mexican American communities. And it was seen as a way of stigmatizing and controlling populations. And again, you see this in the South around the same era, in the 20s and 30s, the stigmatization of heroin and cocaine. Again, the idea of white women being raped by cocaine-crazed Negroes was very prevalent. Time and again, we see that drugs are used for social control of particular groups of people. And that's happened over and over again in our history. Another way drug prohibition makes drugs more dangerous is, for instance, the wall. Trump wants to build a giant wall. Now, I don't think it'll work for a number of reasons, but let's give him the benefit of the doubt. Let's suppose this wall actually works and it stops, let's say, 30% or 50% of the heroin. What happens then after that? It's very, very predictable, and the economics of this is very clear. The drug traffickers will do more of what they're already doing now, which is mixing in fentanyl and carfentanil. These are analogs of fentanyl. And fentanyl can be 50 times more powerful than morphine. Carfentanil could be 10,000 times more potent. And they mix this into the heroin to stretch their profits. It produces a similar opioid effect, but it's far more potent and more dangerous. And that's what's killing people for the most part today with the opioid crisis, is these synthetic substitutes that are entering the drug supply. And if the wall actually works at reducing the amount of drugs, they're going to incentivize the traffickers to introduce more of these adulterants into the existing heroin supply. And as bad as the crisis is today, people will be dropping like flies if this wall actually works. Harm reduction can be anything from needle exchange to overdose prevention. Narcan, for instance, naloxone is an antidote for opioid overdose. It can be drug testing at raves and festivals. Legal or illegal, good or bad, do we legalize or do we prohibit? And that's a false dichotomy, because there is a spectrum of regulatory possibilities in between. You could regulate things much more strictly, like heroin, methamphetamines, things that are much more problematic, and you can be much more liberal in regulation of things like cannabis, regulate more like alcohol. So it's not just a black or white, yes or no, simple dichotomy solution. And as we demonstrate that we can take something that had been previously demonized, reefer badness, and regulate it in a much safer way, that shuts out organized crime and raises revenue and keeps it out of the hands of minors, that you can take something that was demonized and forbidden and regulate it. And that eventually that'll carry over, I think, into the way we talk about other drugs. Are there better ways we can manage this problem rather than having an all-out war on these substances?